So, as I said, welcome everybody. My name is Professor Tracey Reynolds. I'm the Director of the Applied Sociology Research Centre at University of Greenwich, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Adam's book launch, and also Adam in conversation with two very amazing people, Gus John and Gracie May Bradley. So in terms of the structure of this event, Adam's going to very briefly just summarise some of the key aspects of his book. Then we're going to spend the next 50 minutes or so in conversation with Grace and Gus, picking up some of the key issues raised in the book. And then the last half an hour from 8 to 8:30, it'll be the opportunity for the audience to ask any questions. If you could please put your questions in the Q&A. I will also be from time to time checking the chat to see if any questions pop up there. Okay, so in terms of introductions, I'm just going to quickly introduce you to Adam. I'm sure many of you know him. So Adam Elliott-Cooper is a research associate at the Centre for Applied Sociology, research at the University of Greenwich. He received his PhD from the School of Geography and Environment at the University of Oxford in 2016. He has also gone on to work as a researcher in philosophy at UCL and geography at KCL, as well as being a teaching fellow in sociology at Warwick University. He sits on the board of a monitoring group and has worked with a number of youth-led community and campaign groups challenging policing and racism. Adam will be in conversation with Gracie May Bradley, who's a policy expert, writer and campaigner with expertise in civil liberties, state racism and surveillance. She was appointed Interim Director of Liberty in October of last year. She first joined Liberty in 2017 as a policy and campaigns officer, leading work on the intersections of tech and human rights, and has subsequently spent 2 years co-leading this policy and campaigns team and advocacy across policing, counter-terror and migration. Her career has spanned an impressive and broad range of research, policy and casework roles in the UK's NGO sector, including A Room to Heal, Freedom from Torture, the Centre for the Study of Emotion and Law, and Migrants' Right Networks. Gracie has long been involved in the wider grassroots movements for social justice in the UK, including Against Borders for Children campaign to stop children's school records from being used for immigration enforcement. And she also holds an MSc in Human Rights from the LSE and a BA in Philosophy and French from Trinity College, Oxford. Our second discussant is Professor Augustine, but we know him as Gus John. Gus was born in Grenada and came to the UK in 1964 to study theology. He was a member of the Campaign Against Discrimination, which most people know as CARD, in the late 1960s, and a member of the Council of the Institute of Race Relations in the early 1970s. Since arriving in Britain, Gus has been active in issues of education and schooling in Britain's inner cities such as London, Leicester, Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow. He was an assistant education officer and head of community education in the Inner London Education Authority, and in 1989 became the first African Director of Education in Britain. In the 1960s, he worked at the Metro Youth Club in Ladbroke Grove and was one of those who founded the first law centre in Britain, the Notting Hill Law Centre. He was also Runnymede Trust's first researcher and conducted a study of Hounsworth, Birmingham, and wrote Race in the Inner City in 1970. In 1971, he co-authored Because They're Black with Derek Humphrey, then a staff reporter on the Sunday Times. The book won the Martin Luther King Prize later that year. In 1971, he also became a member of the board of the British Council of Churches Community and Race Relations Unit of the World Council of Churches Programme to Combat Racism. In 1972, he and Derek Humphrey published Police Power and Black People, a book that exposed the extent of anti-Blackness and the abuse of police power in the British police. In 1973, he directed a national action research project on youth and race in the inner city. And in 1981, he wrote a report, In the Services of Black Youth, a study on the political culture of youth and community work with Black people in English cities. He was area coordinator of community education in central Manchester. And following the youth uprising against the police in Moss Side, Manchester in 1981, he became chair of the Moss Side Defence Committee and coordinated the community defence of young people arrested during that civil unrest. Professor Gus John has also worked in a number of universities, including as a lecturer in social policy and applied social studies at the University of Bradford during the late 1970s to early 1980s. He was visiting faculty professor of education at the University of Strathclyde, and since 2007, an associate professor of education and honorary fellow of the London Centre for Leadership in Learning at UCL's Institute of Education. Since 2016, he has been visiting professor strategic management at Coventry University. In 1971, he was appointed advisor to the former Home Secretary Jack Straw on race and social inclusion and advised on the Race Relations Act 2000. Just 1 year earlier, Gus John co-founded the Communities Empowerment Network, a charitable organisation providing advocacy and representation for excluded students and their parents and carers. He is now its patron and interim chair. Between 2003 and 2007, he evaluated the race equality policy and action plan of every higher education institution in England, Scotland and Wales for their respective funding council. Professor John serves as an expert witness in a special educational needs tribunal and a special immigration appeals tribunal. In the latter, he advises the court on the capacity of receiving countries to safeguard the rights of children with education, health and care plans if they are deported with their parents. From 2007 to 2011, he was external evaluator for the Law Society of their compliance with equality and human rights legislation. And between 2012 and 2014, Professor John conducted an independent comparative case review for the Solicitors Regulation Authority into ethnic disproportionality in regulatory interventions and outcomes. Most recently, he delivered keynote addresses for the annual conference of the Archives and Record Association at Warwick University, and also the inaugural annual lecture of the British Educational Leadership Management and Administration Society at UCL's Institute of Education, in which he addressed the issue of decolonising curriculum and decolonising educational institutions. And last week, as many of us know, he contributed and provided critical commentary to the BBC programme Subnormal, the British Scandal, which looked at hundreds of Black children in Britain during the 1960s and 70s who were labelled as educational subnormal and were wrongly sent to schools for pupils who were deemed to be of low intelligence. So that's a very illustrious career. Thank you for both of you, Gus and Gracie, for agreeing to discuss Adam's book. So I'm going to hand you over to Adam now to just summarise some key aspects of his book.
Thank you so much, Tracey. I'm not going to spend too long talking about a kind of a summary of the book, but I guess what's important about the book is that I guess there may be 2 or 3 reasons why I wanted to do research on anti-racist and Black organising against policing. I think the first one really came from a frustration with American centrism in a lot of our anti-racist histories and our anti-racist and Black thought. And I really wanted to try to look at what was taking place in other parts of Britain in 1960s and 70s, as well as also parts of Britain's empire and its colonies, its decolonising territories in the 20th century as well, in order to better understand anti-racism today. And then I guess the other reason I thought it was something that was important was because working as a youth worker, I was always interested in engaging young people in social issues, and policing was consistently an issue which the young people that I was working with felt compelled and passionate about and engaged with critically. And I guess the third thing for me that was really important about policing was that I was a youth worker in 2011. And as I'm sure everyone is aware, this was a period in which we saw civil unrest spreading across the whole of England following the police shooting of Mark Duggan in Tottenham in North London. And it was in this year that I became really involved not only in the community campaigns that came before the civil unrest of 2011, particularly following the police killing of the reggae artist Smiley Culture in the February of that year, and the death at the hands of the police of a black man called Kingsley Burrell about a month later, but also the community organising that took place in places like Tottenham and elsewhere after the civil unrest, in which communities began to organise to defend particularly young people from the massive increase in arrests and raids and instances of brutality. And so I really wanted to think about what all of these more perhaps recognisable forms of political organising had to do with a urban and quite spontaneous rebellion, which I think many people were dismissing as not being a political articulation. And so I really wanted to do that. And I think being able to do that has really enabled me to better understand how it is that we have found ourselves in this current moment, in which we've seen the largest anti-racist mobilisations in British history just a year ago, and whether we should understand these mobilisations as coming out of nowhere or as having a distinct history, which goes back not just to 2011, but far deeper into Britain's history of black organising, black power movements and anti-colonial struggles as well. So I'll leave it there in terms of a summary. Thanks, Tracey.
Okay, thank you. So just picking up on that, I would like to begin the discussion by focusing on the theme of Britain's colonial legacy and amnesia. And I wanted to start by asking Gus, what does Britain's national curriculum tell us about how Britain is both proud yet unwilling to engage with its historic empire?
Mute myself.
You're on mute.
Okay, sorry. Good question. Let me start by sharing a quotation. It's not very long. There is, it seems to me, an overwhelming tendency to abstract questions of race from what one might call the internal social and political basis and contexts in British society. That is to say, to deal with race as if it has nothing intrinsically to do with the present condition of England. It's viewed rather as an external problem which has been foisted to some extent on English society from the outside. It's been visited on us, as it were, from the skies. And that's Stuart Hall, in a talk that he gave in 1978, produced in a wonderful and important little book called 5 Views of Multiracial Britain. And in that book, he also made that rather classic comment that race is the modality in which class is lived. Now, I'm saying that to preface my answer, because I believe that even if people like me and people from the Indian subcontinent had not come to this country in such numbers after the Second World War, it was going to be still very important for Britain to level with its own people, white Britain, about what its exploits had been outside of Britain for centuries, and how that came to define them, and indeed the privileges, etc., that they enjoyed. But then talking about the privileges that they enjoyed, we must also remember that there were also contestations within Britain on the axis of class. So when we came, there was a binary narrative that developed. White Britain on the one hand, assumedly homogeneous, assumedly monocultural, and then us, these strangers, black, dark strangers, as Sheila Patterson called us, coming from elsewhere to upset the apple cart. That crudely was how it was presented. So nobody thought, for example, that it was important to engage with the work of somebody like Basil Davidson, who wrote extensively on how, on Africa's contribution to European economic and cultural development. Nobody talked about Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery, or for that matter, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And if you like, a parallel kind of study, Sven Lindqvist's Exterminate All the Brutes. Now, all of that is part of British and European history, but the white working class in this country were never encouraged or assisted in engaging with that in order to help to determine who they were. And so, to a very large extent, schooling and education has failed many generations of people in this country, including the generations that came and were born here after the Second World War. I remember very well, I was working in London, the hullabaloo that ensued after Chris Searle, that wonderful socialist educator, was teaching in Stepney in East London and did some fantastic work with young white working class people developing their own curriculum. So the idea that you had class divisions within the society and the history, the struggles of the white working class were never made center stage in any kind of curriculum. It was therefore not so surprising that Britain didn't even bother to imagine that the curriculum which we ourselves as Black people had been generating over centuries was going to be of any value, not just so that we as Black children or whatever in this country could identify with it, but in order to assist white Britain to understand itself. And that is going on even now. I mean, we will remember in the last period how people like Michael Gove and the rest of them, complete ignoramuses, were determining that this text should be taught in school, that should be taught. You don't need Mary Seacole, you certainly don't need Wole Soyinka and Derek Walcott and those people. Complete and utter nonsense, racist nonsense. So it is in a sense, not only we as Black people, whom that whole system has failed and continues to fail, but generations of white people themselves. And it's been convenient for the state to have that approach because it's easy to whip up racist sentiment and xenophobic sentiment amongst white working people if you continue to present white Black people as Stuart Hall says, alien visited upon the society from nowhere and causing the kind of mayhem that the police believe they're in business to deal with.
Thank you, Gus. Gracie, continuing on with the same theme about Britain's colonial legacies and amnesia, I would like to ask you, can Britain's colonial legacies help us to better understand racist state power generally in the 21st century?
Thanks, Tracey. I mean, in brief, yes. And I think, Adam, your book does a really brilliant job of explaining kind of how and why. And the question really puts me in mind of a meeting that I once had, with a senior civil servant who sort of said to me, and it was a genuine question, but why do European countries have such problems with the police and their minority communities? It was a genuine question. And I was sort of like, well, I'm on work time and I don't have enough time to begin to explain this to you, but I wish I could have, I wish you'd written the book then, Adam, because I would have just asked him to read it. But I think what I found really helpful, kind of the bit of the colonial legacy that I found really helpful and which was kind of new to me in the book, was how you explain the chronology. So, you know, the fact that it's uprisings that lead to militarization, that it's that way round. And kind of the way that you talk about how militarization of policing came to the British mainland, the route that that took. And it helped, for me, it helped me make sense of, you know, if we remember the kind of, well, there's been an ongoing panic about knife crime, but I think it was Gavin Williamson who called maybe last year or the year before for army patrols or armed police in inner city estates. And I think, okay, when you look back, obviously that's bad from a civil liberties perspective, like that's a no-brainer. But when you look back at what that's a continuation of, it helps to make more sense of why that demand came at that time. And so I think it helps us to see the continuities, not that things are the same, but how, you know, how the past informs the present. And that helps us to respond. Because I think especially when you're in a kind of policy, legal advocacy space, and you look at things through a kind of, you know, pure discrimination law lens, one of the conversations you often end up having is, well, look, there's race disproportionality here, but the question is, can it be explained and can it be justified? And if it can, then maybe it's fine. Whereas we have a different kind of conversation when we begin with the kind of foundational point that the odds are it is racist, because then you get much more quickly to, so what are we going to do about it? How are we going to respond to it? You know, and I've seen that in, you know, in conversations around facial recognition, for example, and with a lot of new technologies, you sometimes get people adopt the sort of view from nowhere. This is totally new. Who knows what it will do? Let's think about it from first principles. Whereas actually, when you start with, okay, this is how the state treats racialized communities and has done for decades, you then start with, okay, so what is it likely to do with facial recognition? And you're much further along the line. So I think that colonial legacy is really helpful in helping us understand how the state responds to things now. And so when we see things like the 2011 uprisings and water cannon, or last year's Black Lives Matter protests and the new policing bill, or you know, there's an anecdote in the book, Adam, where you talk about, you know, one of the colonial administrators in Kenya dreaming up concentration camps while he lay on the beach at Malindi. And that immediately brought to my mind, you know, there's a Times article about David Omand, who was the architect of the contest strategy, which was Britain's kind of post 9/11 counter-terror strategy. And, you know, there's an anecdote in there about how he dreamt that up in the bath. So I think these, you know, knowing the colonial legacy really helps us to make sense of what's happening now. And it gives us a different starting point so that we're not always going around the houses, well, maybe this proportionality is justified, or maybe this isn't really happening. And we can just start with, well, this is what's happening. So what are we going to do about it? And that, I think, is really helpful.
Thank you, Gracie. And Adam, just picking up from some of those points that Gracie has mentioned, how do you think Britain's colonial legacy has shaped policing specifically?
Yeah, I think that Gracie made a lot of really useful points. And I think, speaking to both what Gus and Gracie have said, I think picking up on those colonial legacies, what it really does is helps to disrupt Britain's the image that Britain likes to project of itself across the world, right? A place of so-called tolerance, a place where all of that crass race stuff doesn't happen. All that crass race stuff happens in America, happens in South Africa. It doesn't happen here in Britain. Here in Britain, we're respectable, we're honourable. We have a class system, of course, and we love our class system so much that we still have a royal family, but race, certainly not. And I think disrupting that narrative by pointing out that most of British policing hasn't taken place on the British mainland and has taken place in its colonies does both the educational work, I think, which Gus was talking about, but also, of course, does that enables us to better understand the kind of the material reality of state power, right? And the kind of policing policies and practices and ideas that are incorporated into the state's machinery and has done for a very long time. And so trying to do those two things together, it can be quite difficult, but taking policing as a case study, I found has been a really illustrative way of taking like readers and learners and myself on that kind of historical journey, particularly as you've got quite chilling anecdotes of concentration camps being dreamt up whilst sunning yourself on the beach on the east coast of Africa in the 1950s, as well as the more kind of serious anecdotes of what took place within these actual colonial formations and forms of state control. And I guess the other thing that's really useful about it is thinking through racism and is understanding racism as something which isn't simply about some prejudiced officers or some poorly put together policies, but as a system, a global system of imperialism, right? Which was structured in order to extract resources and profits, in order to exploit people and control them, and in order to use violence when and if necessary. And so understanding racism from that point of view, I think, is also a really useful way of utilizing these kinds of colonial histories and how policing is really fundamental to those histories.
Thanks, Adam. It's great. I'd like to ask us, in terms of anti-colonialism, Black Power, how important was decolonization and Pan-Africanism in shaping the Black political movements in the 1970s?
Hugely important. My brother and late friend, publisher John LaRose, who was, if you like, the father of our movement, used to say, we did not come alive in Britain. A profound statement, and one which roots us historically in our anti-colonial struggles in the lands from which we came. Two things need to be said. One is that while we were struggling against colonialism and the plantation system in the Caribbean, and all sorts of other things were going on in Africa and the scramble for Africa, there were other things going on here too, in the sense that the white working class were building a workers' movement, and to a very large extent, the British state tried to keep separate our struggles in the Caribbean and what the working class people in this country were doing. And C.L.R. James writes extensively about that very, very helpfully. So what is the significance of that? The significance is that we came to this country having had a lot of experience of struggling against racism, struggling against mercantile capitalism and the exploitation of African people in order to build Europe and make Europe rich, basically. And of course, the British could always be depended upon to send frigates, warships of one sort or another, and put down rebellions. The Queen was represented in those islands by a governor general, and that's still the case today, believe it or not. So all of that was happening, and we had to resist. The one gift we all have as human beings is a fundamental instinct for freedom. And cultures of oppression spawns cultures of resistance. And that's been part of our history as Black people, especially in places like Southern Africa, in places like the Caribbean, in colonized territories. So we came here equipped with all of that experience, including an experience of organization, an experience of struggle, an experience of making coalitions with those who also believe in racial justice and in social justice. the activities of the Pan-Africanists, not only here in London, here in England, but in the Caribbean, was significant. It was significant because it drove the independence movement in many of those islands. And it was also significant in that those of us who came over here from wherever, people like Henry Sylvester Williams, late 19th century, from Trinidad, and started the League of Colored Peoples in England, started the first Pan-African conference in England in 1900. People like them and those who came after them, right up to 1945, and the Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester, were very, very clear that they had a dual function. They had a function to help British people understand what was going on in the territories from which they had come. They had a function to challenge and hold the British government of the day to account in terms of what they were continuing to do in those territories and what they were doing to the Black people who were here. And one of the reasons why I'm so opposed to all this rubbish about Windrush, which is frankly a disgrace, is that that narrative truncates that history. It makes everybody believe that we only had some presence and some importance in this land after that wretched ship dislodged 92 people at Tilbury Docks. Complete nonsense, a falsification of history. So if one really wants to understand how our movement against British racism and class oppression and exploitation took shape in this country, we have to remember what we did in the Caribbean and what those who came out of the Caribbean in that whole period between 1900 and 1945 actually did here in Britain. And if we don't teach our own children that, so that they understand what the foundation is upon which they are building a movement, Black Lives Matter, the youth movements around the country, then we are failing them as well as failing all of those white young people who, with them together, have got to chart the history of multi-ethnic Britain.
Thank you very much, Gus. And Adam, thinking about your book, much of the historical section of Black resistance to British policing makes use of Race Today magazine. And I wanted to ask why this is such an important resource for you.
So I think I first came across Race Today magazine. It was either in the George Padmore archive or the Institute of Race Relations archives. And I'd never really read something so exciting that was also so, I guess, so British in a lot of ways. I guess I'd read the kind of quite, you know, I was accustomed to the Black Power rhetoric of the United States, right? I'd read Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X and Angela Davis and all of these people, Elaine Brown and others. But I hadn't really been able to enjoy and appreciate the kind of comparable analysis that was coming out of Britain in the 1960s and 70s. I mean, I guess I'd read Sivanandan, who was maybe, you could say, kind of wrote and articulated himself in a similar way. But it was really in Race Today that I really became, it really captured me. It really captured my imagination. But also there was something about the politics as well. The politics really spoke to me as well. And as I said before, it was thinking about how class, or as Gus said earlier, race is the modality through which class is lived. The idea that racism becomes material, becomes tangible through class. And the magazine was able to really vividly articulate this politics in very plain language, in very accessible language, but also really beautiful and compelling language as well. The other thing that I guess I really loved about it was the kind of reporting that it did. The fact that these journalists, many of whom had beforehand run newspapers like The Black Voice and others, if they're part of the Black Unity and Freedom Party and other Black Power newspapers in the decades before, were reporting not only from strikes and rebellions and protests across Britain, but were also providing reports from the socialist movements in Grenada, or the anti-imperial movements in parts of Mozambique or Angola, or the anti-apartheid movements in what was then Rhodesia and South Africa. And thinking through all of these kind of amazing international reports, as well as these very kind of gritty, real local reports, I think it made me kind of, I guess, jealous that I wasn't around at the time to be able to read it in that particular moment. But it also made me inspired to try to do justice to that history in recounting it through that particular section of my book.
Thank you, Adam. So moving on, also wanted to focus on the failures of Macpherson, and I wanted to ask us, as someone who was very active in the Stephen Lawrence campaign and had an impact on the Macpherson inquiry, could you talk about how the changes of policing post-Macpherson fell short of the demands which were made by the campaigners such as yourself?
Macpherson was clearly important. And I think many people forget what preceded the appointment of William Macpherson to chair that inquiry. Massive struggles to get the state even to understand that there were things fundamentally wrong about the police investigation that needed to be interrogated for a whole variety of reasons, because it went further than just policing. It went to the heart of the matter as far as the relentless killings of Black people by racist and neo-fascist groups was concerned. Because 1993, Stephen is murdered. Prior to that, there had been all sorts of killings of Black people, and particularly of people from the Indian subcontinent all around the country. Paki bashing wasn't just some racial slur. It was literal. Paki bashing and Paki killing. And in 1966, one of the first organizations that those people who came from the Caribbean started was the West Indian Standing Conference. Joe Hunt was one of the founders of the WISC. And he wrote this wonderful, shocking little monograph called Nigger Hunting in London. And he was talking not about the National Front and Column 88 and the rest of them. He was talking about the British police. So police from Brixton Police Station, as he said in the book, would be going out into their squad cars to go on patrol, and they would announce glibly, nonchalantly, to the friends in the police station, we are going nigger hunting. Now, I'm not talking about 1825. I'm talking about yesterday, you know? So we have to understand that while people got totally hung up about, and the police themselves, about Macpherson's claim that the police were institutionally racist, some of us didn't need Macpherson or anybody else to tell us that. We had known about it for a long time, had written about it for a long time. Institute of Race Relations, people like myself, when I did the book with Humphrey in 1970 and 71, we sat in police, in magistrates' courts, visited police stations, saw what was going on. I mean, if you have a chance to read that book, and you can get it from some place or other for less than £365, you would find that much of what is in it continued up until Macpherson and after. So what happened after Macpherson? One of his recommendations was that there should be police training. It's the panacea for everything. You want to bring about some metamorphosis in racism awareness training. You call it unconscious bias, and you set up an industry to get people to go spreading it all around the place, right? So what was happening in terms of that training is that people genuinely believed that if you train police officers to be less racist, then the plight, the experience of Black people would be different. Totally false, because what that failed to do was to address the systemic and structural issues to do with policing. The government was sending out particular signs to the police as to what the function should be through its immigration laws and through its inserting of them as, if you like, extensions of border control and the immigration service. So they would be going and raiding factories and what they call sweatshops, etc., to see whether there were Black people there who couldn't give an account of their residency in the country. I personally had to throw some police out of a house in Manchester when an Asian taxi driver gets murdered by racists. The police go to the home to ask questions about whether the family knew of any enemies this person may have had. And rather than concentrating on the murder, with all of these families there grieving at this sudden loss, they decide to start asking people about their immigration status. So we had to physically kick them out. Now, why am I saying all of this? I'm saying this because unless we understand that there are four elements to this. On the one hand, there's the politics that frames policing in Britain in a particular manner, as Adam has so eloquently expressed in the book. There's the politics, and the politics of anti-Blackness and of resistance to the Black presence, which we see played out in things like the hostile environment, is the political framework within which the police are operating. All right. And then there's the police practices. Practices supported by a culture which is itself anti-Black. And if you want to find out more about that, just get a member of the National Black Police Association in a room with you in confidence and let them spill the beans. They would tell you what they as police officers experience in policing. Steve McQueen in his red, white, and blue sequence in the Small Act series dealt with that particular issue. Okay, so there are those practices, and the culture supports the practices. And it's not just canteen culture as is commonly known. It's the general culture of having a war on Black people, a war particularly on Black youths, and it's deliberate. The Home Office invited me in 2003 or something to do an evaluation, an academic evaluation of all the training that had been taking place within the 43 police forces in the country following the implementation of that Macpherson recommendation. And it was for me a painful experience. It was an even more painful experience for those Black people hired by the Ionan organization that won the contract to deliver this training up and down the place. I sat in training rooms and experienced some horrendous practices on the part of police towards those trainers. Many of them had to go into therapy because of the experiences they were having at the hands of the police. So the recommendation was sound, Jack Straw made sure that it was implemented. But frankly, the police themselves, senior officers had no accountability where that was concerned. Many of them were advising police community relations people to get out of that role as early as they can, because as far as they were concerned, community relations, the whole community relations area within policing was what one called a career graveyard. And that tells you a whole lot about the attitude towards those things. So in my view, Macpherson did what he did. The failure was in believing that you could tackle policing through training and whatever without understanding and exploring those four elements I've talked about: politics, practice, culture, accountability.
Thank you so much, Gus, for that. I'd like to ask Gracie actually a similar question. I wanted to ask you, what impact has post-Macpherson anti-racist reforms, such as diversity drives, unconscious bias training, which Gus talked about, and police community consultation, had on eroding institutional racism?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. And obviously Gus has, I think, touched really well on a lot of the themes that I would want to raise. I mean, I suppose I would say additionally, in fact, let me put this in the chat. So, I mean, that's kind of Liberty's submission to the Hask inquiry to Macpherson 20 years on. And we looked at kind of key areas in police use of power to see, you know, what's the disproportionality? How are these powers being used? How are they being wielded? Is it institutionally racist? Is it not? And so on. And I mean, the reality is that, you know, now Black people, we're 9 times more likely to be subject to stop and search than white people. 21% of use of electroshock weapons is against Black people, despite us being 3% of the population. You know, there's race disproportionality across essentially all police use of force. And I wanted to talk, you know, we've seen the Lamy review, which establishes that there is racism at essentially every level. There's disproportionality at every level of people's interaction with the criminal punishment system. And I wanted to talk just a bit about stop and search and the best use of stop and search scheme, because that's something that was brought forward by Theresa May to kind of address this persistent disproportionality in stop and search. And what happened is that, yes, overall, rates of stop and search did fall, but the remaining use was concentrated on Black people and other racialized people. So this ostensible reform made things worse. And, you know, Theresa May had promised, oh, well, if that doesn't work, then we'll have primary legislation that will properly curtail the use of stop and search, which I think was, you know, that's a legitimate thing to aim for. But of course, it never happened. What we actually ended up with, and what was quite interesting and obviously really rubbish in 2018 is, you know, some of you will remember Stopwatch and Release published that report, The Colour of Injustice. And that kind of set out that analysis that the remainder of stop and search was concentrated on Black people and on racialized people. And for a minute, that public conversation moved from gang crime, knife crime, panic to actually, does something need to be done about Section 1 stop and search? What did we then get? Oh, well, we're actually going to remove reasonable grounds entirely. That was the threat the government made. And what they then did was massively got rid of a lot of those best use of stop and search safeguards for Section 60 and have continued to bring in more stop and search powers. So, I mean, we're not in a great place when you look at kind of concretely what has happened in terms of racism in the use of coercive powers. And those reforms that some people have advocated for, you know, the unconscious bias training and the diversity drives and the consultation, you know, it's been a couple of decades, right? That it hasn't worked. And there are a lot more. There are some, you know, Liberty, we're obviously a human rights organization. I think abolition throws a really interesting challenge to us, but we're certainly not all the way down that road. But there are things that people could be advocating for that would be far more effective than some of these relatively toothless things that have been asked for. You know, we could be talking about rolling taser back to firearms officers. We could be talking about primary legislation to curtail suspicion-based stop and search. We could be talking about banning facial recognition and predictive profiling technology. So ending the use of spit hoods. There are lots of things that we could be talking about that aren't unconscious bias training, especially given how long that has had to work, and actually things appear to have gotten worse. And I suppose the other thing that I'd say about the shape of institutional racism, and I think this is particularly, can be particularly keenly observed after the events of 2011, but obviously has kind of longer roots, is consistent move towards pre-criminality, to kind of coercive interventions prior to kind of any sort of charge or conviction, purely on the basis of some kind of perceived suspicion. And I think we see that, Adam, you discuss knife crime prevention orders in the book, especially under New Labour, there was this big proliferation of civil orders, which meant that you could bypass the courts entirely, with whatever safeguards they provided, and intervene and place conditions on people's most basic freedoms, on the basis of something that really wasn't very strong. So I think we've seen a move towards pre-criminality, and we've also seen the move, it's just been quite totalizing. So if you look across counter-terror, policing and immigration enforcement, what we consistently see is people being assigned a kind of suspect or racialized status, so domestic extremist, gang nominal, undocumented migrant, and so on. And then we see the state intervening with a person's ability to access essential public services and kind of exercise the most basic freedoms, often through the use of non-consensual data sharing. So I think what we've seen is this kind of big expansion of kind of the state's capacity to be institutionally racist. And that's being undergirded by new technologies like facial recognition, predictive policing, digital extraction tools, and so on. So yeah, I guess it's quite a pessimistic assessment of the efficacy of unconscious bias and diversity drives and so on. But I think that also maybe liberates us to think about different things.
Thank you, Gracie. Adam, I just wanted to ask you, do you think the Macpherson inquiry is still relevant to grassroots activists challenging police racism today?
I think that the Stephen Lawrence campaign, particularly for people like Gracie and I, was the kind of one of the most influential anti-racist campaigns when we were growing up. Right? We learned so much just from seeing how influential not just the family, but the community around that family could be in not simply striving for justice following a racist killing, but changing the racial discourse of this country, right? Making institutional racism I don't want to say household name, that sounds odd, but certainly a very common phrase, right? Pushing back against the idea that there are these bad apples, there are these problems with a few people being prejudiced, and saying that there is an institutional problem. I think that obviously the problems that arose from it, of course, which both Gus and Gracie have already outlined beautifully, which is of course what the government kind of agreed to do, is where the kind of problems lie, and where I think grassroots organisations are pushing for something different. Because of course it wasn't just the police and other public sector organisations that took heed of this necessity for diversity drives and what have you. It was of course also, as we've seen very recently, the Conservative Party, who have probably utilised the idea of diversity drives more effectively than maybe any other institution in 21st century Britain. And I think having people like we've seen run the ethnic and racial disparities report, or the people who have been put as to run for the Conservative Party's mayoral candidate for London, and of course the people that we see occupying the Home Office and other key sections of the Conservative cabinet, demonstrates the failings of these attempts at diversity as a route out of racism. And I think what that does, of course, is it kind of I think ends the conversation of diversity as the solution to racism. It stops people from realistically being able to argue that diversity is going to be the silver bullet. You cannot have the kinds of embarrassing, let's face it, embarrassing clowns that the Conservative Party have put to represent Black Britain into these different positions of power, and take seriously the kinds of arguments diversity that I think have dominated a lot of anti-racist discourses since the Macpherson report. And of course, similar things have been said in the United States with Black Lives Matter arising during the presidency of Barack Obama. And so I think it's opening up, as Gracie said, a really important opportunity for us to look beyond these more superficial reforms and demand the kind of substantive changes that were being demanded by the Black Power movement in the 20th century. And I think in many ways are being picked up by the newer movements that we've seen rising in the last 5 or 10 years.
Thank you, Adam. And Gracie, I wanted to just ask you, in the book, Adam talks about the rise of demands to defund the police, prisons and border powers in Britain. And why do you think these demands have increased in prominence over the last few years?
Yeah, it's really hard to say. I think part of it, and Adam, again, you talk about kind of the specific context of austerity. In the, we've just the shape of the state, which I think has been really exemplified in the context of the pandemic. This kind of, and look, I'm not going to say that there are no problems with racism in the NHS or social services and so on. Like, that's obviously not the case. But I think this hollowing out of all of the services that have even the capacity to support human flourishing, and this enormous expansion of those that consist primarily in coercive power, and also the co-option of those other services into that coercive agenda, I think it just means that the space for really believing that, some more diversity or, some tweaks around the edges, the space for believing that that's really going to fundamentally change how people's lives are, especially working class, racialized young people, is a fiction that can't really hold anymore. So I think that that's part of it. And as I say, I think it's that kind of, that totalizing push to kind of, the totalizing way in which the state can now intervene in people's lives. The way the threshold is so low and the ramifications can be so significant. I think it's just gotten progressively more extreme. So yeah, I think that's part of it. I also think, though, that these demands around defunding and abolition, they're not just demands around resourcing those parts of the state, not the state, but resourcing communities in a way that means that we might organize ourselves more towards our own flourishing. I think that's part of it. That's a big part of it. But also, it's a way of breaking that impasse between what, reform and revolution, essentially, because it helps give a conceptual framework for thinking through, okay, so this thing isn't going to happen tomorrow. And as I say, Liberty is not kind of an abolitionist organization as such. We're a human rights organization. But I think where we intersect is on that question of, well, all right, should we expand the scope of this thing? Or is there some change that, rather than tweaking or displacing this thing, is there a way to shrink it? And can we create more space and more resources for just another answer to this social problem? Because I think I guess that gets to the heart of what I'm saying about the shape of the state that's been exemplified in the pandemic. It's just the policing as the solution, policing, criminalization, punishment, incarceration, that as the primary solution to so many social problems. So I think, abolition, demands around defund, they just offer a different way of thinking about that. They just offer us a different way of thinking about how our society might be organized, how our human rights might be best realized, and especially, I think, in a way that doesn't center policing. It's not just a negative agenda, it's also, what do we want? What could we build?
Thank you, Gracie. I'm just very mindful of time. We said that we would give half an hour to the discussion. So just very quickly, just a reminder, if you do have any questions or comments, if you could put them in the Q&A or in the chat. Mindful of time, I think I'm going to give Adam the final word. And I wanted to ask Adam about Black resistance to British policing, and it ends with a call for abolition. And what do you want readers to take away from this revolutionary vision?
Thanks, Tracey. So I think that I want to borrow or maybe steal a really great kind of bit of analogy that a friend of mine, Derek Pennell, used recently. She said that getting police to deal with social problems, including violence and crime, is kind of like telling your landlord that you've got a hole in your roof and they turn up with a bucket. And when you tell them that the problem is getting worse, they turn up with your house a week later with a bigger bucket. And yes, of course, if you've got a leaky roof, you need a bucket to catch the water. No one is denying the necessity of a bucket when there is water coming into your roof. But a bucket is never going to mend that roof. The bucket is never going to end the problem of the leak. It's only going to delay it. It's only going to momentarily hold that tide. And I think that's a useful analogy of thinking about how policing operates. We, of course, are not in a position to end police and prisons, as Gracie mentioned, tomorrow, unfortunately. And in fact, I think more crucially, we cannot have defunding the police unless it comes alongside investments in communities. And so while we might say that the police is the kind of the bucket holding back the water, like catching the drips of water, fixing the roof is what we would call decent jobs and strong trade unions. It's what we would call council housing, particularly for our young people. It's what we would call properly funded youth services and mental health provision, and support for survivors of domestic violence and child abuse, and supports for people who use drugs problematically. All of the kind of community-led resources that are necessary to live a meaningful and prosperous existence. And currently, our young people don't have any of those things. They don't have access to any of those fundamentals, unfortunately. And so for me, I think defunding the police is a call for investment. It's a call for building. It's a call for change. And it's a call that enables people who might not necessarily always think of themselves as being part of a struggle against police violence, who might work for a renters union or a trade union, who might work in mental health provision or drug rehabilitation, who might work in a school or a youth centre, to understand the work that they do can help us to build the kind of society that we need in order to erode our reliance on an ever-expanding and failing police, prison and border system. And so for me, that's one of the reasons I thought it was so crucial. But I think the other quick reason, if I may, is that I think abolition is in many ways how a newer generation of people is articulating revolution. I think in the 1960s and 70s, from the literature I've read and the people I've spoken to, global revolution was the word of that time. Right? That's what the Black Power movement was talking about. And I think that this is unsurprising, given that global revolution was seen to be a distinct possibility. The Cold War was raging, the Third World was decolonizing. You had all of these radical movements taking place across the world. Global revolutions felt possible. Into the 21st century, it's more difficult, I think, to see the world in that kind of way necessarily. But as Gracie mentioned, this massive expansion in police and prison power, which has seen the prison population more than double since the Black Power movement in the 1970s in Britain, which has seen a massive expansion in police and border regimes in this country, I think perhaps quite predictably means that revolutionary visions turn to a dismantling of this authoritarian state machinery, turn to trying to utilize our resistance to this form of state violence as a way to also build alternatives to it concurrently. And so I think that it's an opportunity for us to think about not only what it is that we don't want, but as Gracie rightly pointed out, what we need and what we need to build and what we need to survive. And I hope that's what people take away from the ideas that I'm trying to put forward in this book.
Thank you, Adam. So we're now going to open the the discussion up to the audience. So if you do have any questions or comments, if you could put them in the Q&A and the chat. I do have a couple of questions. Adam, congratulations on your important and urgent piece of work. And as we saw or see more state dependency from youth charities via austerity measures, how can services for young people resist over violent policing of young people? And how can such spaces for young people return to the more radical roots of resistance? So that's quite a big question, actually.
It's a huge question. But do you know what? I'm very fortunate in that over the last 5 or 10 years, I've been able to work with a number of amazing youth-led organisations that are trying to develop responses to serious youth violence, which do not rely or minimise their reliance on the police. Organisations like the Forefront Project, working in the north of London, which is working on particular estates where they work with a lot of the young people there, doing the kind of conflict resolution that's necessary before violence, before conflict escalates into violence, doing the kind of community building there, which can provide safe spaces, which can provide education and training, which can provide all of the kind of social resources that we need to have the strong communities necessary to establish safety. Organisations like Take Back the Power, which works in Camden, doing very kind of similar work, making demands from the local schools and colleges not to have police officers put into their schools, but to have mental health practitioners and counsellors put into their schools for their young people facing stress and anxiety, or who might experience trauma or abuse. Demanding the kinds of resources from schools to keep them open on the weekends and the evenings so that people have somewhere safe to hang out and to be. All of these kinds of demands are coming out of these great movements like Take Back the Power. Or other youth-led movements like No More Exclusions, which is fighting against school exclusion, which of course disproportionately affects Black young people. Places like Scotland have almost completely eradicated school exclusion. And I think it's really integral for us to try to not only resist the kind of school exclusions that we're seeing taking place, and of course Gus has recently broadcast a fantastic documentary on the ways that school exclusion and pupil referral units are steeped in racism, and that racism is, of course, has historical roots in this country. But also how there is what's often referred to as a prison pipeline, and how many of our young people who are excluded from school end up being more likely to be affected by serious youth violence and more likely to end up harmed or incarcerated. There are other groups as well, like Voices That Shake and Knowledge is Power. There are lots of fantastic youth organisations out there trying to build, realising that there is a serious problem in our communities in relation to serious youth violence, but policing is not going to solve those issues in the long term, and trying to build the kinds of solutions that are needed are really being developed by some of the most inspiring young people that I've ever come across. And I can't help but feel hopeful for the future when I work with some of the young people involved in these kinds of organisations, because they're not only are they organised, are they determined, but they're visionary as well.
Thank you. Adam, what you said seems to us really sort of resonated with a few people. So you sort of touched on the second question, which was asking for examples of communities and good practices to flesh out these alternatives. And just a comment really to say that this is from Sally, that she really, really likes your bucket metaphor and the breadth of what is needed to fix the roof. And just comments again, just endorsing the examples that you have given as well. Right, I'm just going to move to the chat to see if there are any comments there.
I should probably quickly say that the buckets metaphor is not mine, it's Derricka Pennell's. I should definitely give her the credit for that.
Yeah.
I think it's a useful one.
I think just related to that, because you gave an examples, but how do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has been an opportunity to also envisage what healthy local communities might look like?
I think there's two things that we've seen really arise out of the pandemic. I think one of them, of course, is people's realisation that the government are I think if we're being kind, we'd say they're incapable. I think if we were more realistic, we'd say they're unwilling to put the health and safety of the country first, or as a priority in a crisis in the way that we've seen. But I think we'd also, of course, see that, as Gracie mentioned, policing is again seen as such a crucial solution to the problem. They're like a hammer looking for a nail, I think, this government in many ways, and they have reaffirmed their authoritarianism and their commitment to a more aggressive state since the pandemic, and they've used it as a real opportunity to try to push through a number of different reforms, expanding police power. But I think the third thing that I think is really crucial is that the other thing that we've seen coming out of the pandemic are, of course, mutual aid groups all over this country, which have sought to develop independent, community-led forms of infrastructure and support and mutual aid, which have recognized either explicitly or implicitly that the state isn't interested in providing the most vulnerable people in society with the fundamental resources that they need to live on a day-to-day basis, like having food, access to food, or getting medicine to them, or all of the other things that you would expect one of the top 10 richest countries in the world to be able to organize and furnish effectively. And I think this is presented an opportunity not for the states to retract further welfare provision because they know that people are just going to survive among themselves, but for people to be more critical of this current government, for people to realize that this current government is as bad as so many of us have been saying for so long. And I think that people's realization of that is not unconnected to the mass mobilizations we've seen since the pandemic, from the Black Lives Matter movements to the feminist mobilizations following the police killing of Sarah Everard, following the massive Kill the Bill coalitions resisting the government's new policing bill. All of these, I think, mobilizations are not unconnected from this realization that this government, not only does it not care about the people that it tells us it doesn't care about, migrants, Black people, etc., but it also doesn't care about even its main constituents. It even doesn't care about the older people that brought it into power. I think it is in many ways self-destructive, and I think that this pandemic, as destructive and as horrendous as it has been, has illuminated so many issues within this society and better enabled, I think, people to resist them.
Yeah, shone a real spotlight on all of these inequalities, hasn't it? Okay, I've got a question from Laura Kelly, and she was saying that the public is not really in support of defunding the police. So how can the police be convinced towards seeking alternatives? So I'd like to ask Adam, then Gracie, and then maybe Gus if we have time, or there might be another question for Gus. So Adam.
So as I said, well, I guess the first thing it makes me think about is the fact that I think abolitionism is how grassroots movements today articulate global revolution. And unfortunately, in the 1970s, a lot of the general public weren't necessarily in favour of global revolution either. But what I would say is that although if I said the word, let's defund the police to a random person on a high street, they'd probably say it's a terrible idea. But if I said to them, actually policing isn't the best way to improve public safety, and punishing people isn't really a deterrent, and there isn't any evidence that it is, but if there is actually a lot of evidence that people are less likely to be criminalised if they have a decent paying job and a secure home and access to mental health provision, they'd probably say, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense as a policy proposal. And so I think part of it is about I think demystifying the politics of defunding the police, which I think there's been a bit of a moral panic around through certain sections of the press and certainly certain sections of our political class. And I think it's about articulating the fact that it isn't simply about stripping away, or to not overuse this metaphor, taking away the buckets that's stopping our leak, but actually trying to fix that roof, that I think we can hopefully gain more popular support for, I think, what's a really urgent crisis in this country.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask the same question to Gracie, from your, your perspective?
Yeah, and it's a really interesting question. And I think that, sometimes we're presented with public opinion as, a thing that is a fact that will not move, and therefore we do what we can around it. And so I think it's really important to remember, especially for us as campaigners, that it's good to know where public opinion is. It's also good to know that we can move it. So I think that's an important place to start. And I think, as Adam says, there's something really important about giving people options. I think one thing that the pandemic has really shown, and also just the shape of governance over recent decades has shown, is that very often people are presented with X or nothing. So you kind of presented with, have this punitive thing, which may do something, or have nothing. And that's often the ground on which people kind of make these decisions about, well, okay, is it policing or nothing, right? I can understand why that would make people anxious. So you have to give people options. We have to have options. I think it was Ipsos Mori did some quite interesting polling about the hostile environment and immigration. And, when you do slightly more complex polling, so I think they asked people something like, would you rather have an immigration system that was really, really efficient, but also led to enforcement against some people where it wasn't warranted? Or would you rather have a slightly more lax system, but it wouldn't result in kind of massive injustices? People were like, okay, well, actually, we don't want to be really draconian. Can we have the other one? And obviously there's a whole thing to be problematized about who gets enforced against and who doesn't under an immigration system. But the basic point is, sometimes give people options and sometimes ask people to consider the trade-offs. Because I also think that the other thing that goes on is that, what we've seen for years and years and years is this kind of continued dismissal and refusal to listen to kind of what that trade-off is in policing. What are the human rights issues that policing produces, not just the human rights issues that policing claims to address. So I think, we kind of have to treat people like, it's not about meeting people where they are. We have to treat people as if maybe they're gonna come with us, maybe with a broader scope of options, they might think differently. But I think it's really, all of this is about making clear to people, we can do better than something or nothing. We owe it to ourselves to do something more than that. Thank you.
Gus, I'd like to ask you whether you think there are any spaces in today's societies for reproducing a kind of analysis of race today.
Yes, indeed, it's very necessary at this point in time. Actually, I mean, I was looking through some documents earlier on today for another purpose, and I was struck by the fact that for pretty much 30, 40 years since I lived in this country, there was almost a dependence, if you like, on grassroots journals, papers, broadsheets, and papers such as the West Indian World and its successor, Caribbean Times and The Voice, and so on, to articulate some of the issues that we've been discussing in this meeting. There was a time when, especially when we were writing those books, Humphrey and I, at the beginning of the 1970s, those kinds of matters were not covered at all by the mainstream media. So it was as if what we were suffering in the society, particularly at the hands of racists and of the police, was immaterial and not of sufficient public interest to the rest of the nation. Race today was in my view, one of the most important developments that there's been in this country. I used to write for the magazine. As you said in your introduction, I was a member of the Institute of Race Relations before the split came and Race Today went to Brixton, and the Institute of Race Relations went to King's Cross. It did two things, and it did both excellently. One was to give a voice to the voiceless, particularly amongst Black people, to help us articulate our demands and our interventions within the trade union movement, which was white and which in many instances was itself excluding of our interests and the sorts of analysis we made of what was wrong with the labor in the society. And it gave a vision. It anchored our struggles and gave some direction to the struggles that we were waging on all kinds of things: health, schooling, policing itself, immigration, and of course international matters. Because you know the work that Race Today did in relation to struggles outside of this country was pretty phenomenal, and that is why when in 1981 we determined that we would have an international book fair of radical Black and third world books, with a book fair festival appended to that, or as an integral part of it rather. It wasn't so surprising that with Race Today, New Beacon Books, Bogle Louverture Publications as organizers, we were able to bring people from across the 5 continents who had been engaged with us in dialogue and in collaborations on all sorts of struggles, from India to Trinidad to France and Italy and so on. So I believe that it is important for a journal of that sort to re-emerge, and especially be an instrument for the kind of groups that Adam was talking about. Those youth groups who have a hell of a lot to say, but who won't get a chance to say it in The Guardian, God knows, never mind anything else. And that independent publishing, that independent voice, fearlessly taking on the state, taking on employers, taking on the trade union movement itself, and indicating to them what it is they must be doing if they want to build a society with a hallmark of humanity and racial justice and social justice. It's clearly very, very necessary. And I can see Adam championing the rise of one such.
Thank you so much. Very mindful of time, but there was a couple of questions which, you know, one of them resonates with me. I think the question was to Adam, and it was a question about the location of feminist discourses and Black feminism in your consideration of Black resistance to policing, also young women as well as young men. So I just wanted to ask you to reflect on that a bit.
Sure. I guess I think about the politics of gender in maybe 2 or 3 key ways in the book. One of them is an exploration of the fact that almost every campaign against a Black death at the hands of the police in this country is led by a woman, whether it be a mother or a sister, a partner, or other family member. One of the most famous, of course, would be Doreen Lawrence, but there are many more which are far less known and have been doing tireless work resisting state violence over the decades. And I think this was really crucial for me for thinking through, number one, trying to grapple with why it is that there is this, I guess, this gendered nature of Black resistance to policing in this country, and of course in other parts of the world as well. And for me, that enabled me to think through how partly, I would say, a lot of these women utilize in a kind of strategic way how the fact that they can be differently received as a grieving family member in comparison with an activist who might be demanding changes to state power who is not seen to be a grieving family member. And there are certain ways in which I think that politics of care is not confined to this very kind of gendered role within the home, but is actually an articulation of a very kind of public anti-state radical politics of care, which I think is really, really useful for seeing the ways in which Black feminism is alive in the politics of resistance to policing in Britain, even if many of the women who are involved in these struggles might not necessarily articulate it as a politics of Black feminism. I think we see the ways in which this radical politics of care is used to great effect across this country. The other way in which I think through gender, and the way in which I found Black feminism really useful, is the way in which particularly Black conservatives in this country have been denigrating the Black family. People like, I hate to have to name them, but people like Sean Bailey and Tony Sewell obsess over the lack of a patriarch within the Black family as the moral compass of young Black people, as if Black women are not able to offer moral guidance to the children in their home, and as if even if men are not present in a home, this somehow means that this home is chaotic and deficient and lacking. And I think I found the Black feminist literature on this framing of the Black family, which of course has its roots in British colonial history as a space of chaos and deviance, rather than being the Black family being a space of care and love, and so through that kind of critique, it also enables me to again better think through the resistance of the Black women who lead so many, almost all of these campaigns against Black deaths in custody. Because again, not only are they resisting the state through this radical politics of care, they're also resisting these racist stereotypes around Black women and the Black family being these spaces of deviance and chaos and not places of care as well. And I think the third thing that's really crucial that these movements do is that they expand notions of the family. The family isn't just this nuclear space with, two parents and some children and this very kind of heterosexual space. The family becomes an articulation of community. The family becomes an articulation of a wider sense of solidarity. And I think thinking about family in that more radical, solidaristic community sense, again, is something that is really inspiring from the women who are leading so many of these campaigns against Black deaths at the hands of the state in this country.
Thank you, Adam. That was great. I'm very mindful of time, and I've been told I need to stick to time as well. It's been a fascinating discussion. You're all amazing anyway. So I can't thank you enough. It was amazing just to be part of this and just listening to all the different sort of the critiques and analysis and debates. So I'd like to thank Professor Gus John for giving your time and your amazing long history of race relations in Britain today, and just being you're a legend. We've got a legend here with us today, so it's really nice. And Gracie, again, thank you for your insightful, amazing sort of work. We need the Gracies in academia as well, but it's nice that you're in other spaces, other important spaces as well. And Adam, well, what can I say? It's a star. I was known you're a star. And your book is, I'm sure it's going to sell very well. There was a comments coming in congratulating you on the book and saying it's important in terms of the sort of discourses around race in this country, but also in other countries as well. And I'm sure that it's going to be well received. So thank you. And thank you for the audience as well for coming along, listening, contributing with your questions and your comments.
Yeah, I just want to again, say thank you so much, Gracie, Gus, and Tracey, for having this conversation with me. It really means a lot to have all three of you here with me today. And thank you so much to everyone who's taken the time out of their evening to look at another Zoom. I really appreciate you taking the time as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to the events team before we go, Karen,
Okay.
Azar, and for organising this. Okay, everybody, have a good evening. Take care.
Thanks, Gracie. Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.